moved out here to Flagstaff right after college. I was looking for a job, and I took a job that was an entry-level position with a nonprofit. And this nonprofit was something called a radio reading service. Not that important that you know, but basically it's a radio that helps people who are blind. And in order to get this radio service, there are actually physical radios that were mailed to the listeners. So when I started, I became the marketing and outreach coordinator. And it was my job to try to reach out to the listeners of these radios and to get more listeners of the radios. Seems simple enough. I didn't have very much experience in this field, but I thought, how hard could it be? I started this job, and quickly I figure out that this job has high turnover. Even though it wasn't an AmeriCorps position, it was a regular job, there had been a new person as the marketing and outreach coordinator every year, sometimes only every 9 months, since as far back as the records seem to show. And there weren't very many records. Part of how I deduced the fact that there were so many different marketing and outreach coordinators is because a lot of the stuff we did was still by hand, and there was different handwriting. But literally, I was dissecting people's handwriting to try to match up records and figure out what was from last year, what might have been from 2 years ago. It was a mess. There was no dates on anything. There was no helpful information for me when I started. And of course, the last coordinator was long gone and hadn't really left any information for me. And my manager was completely too busy to train me. Sound familiar? Oh, hopefully you had a better orientation and onboarding experience than that. But my experience is, if you had an AmeriCorps, you'll probably have something like this happen to you as soon as you get out, especially if you're going into nonprofits. So I was dealing with this new job, didn't know what I was supposed to do, and I'm just trying to dissect the information based on people's handwriting. One of my first tasks was that I had to make sure our records were up to date of who actually our listeners were, since it was my job to communicate with them. Well, keep in mind, these listeners, first of all, they're blind, but most of them are elderly. And so I ended up with this horrible task, which was that I had to call people, many of whom were in their late 80s or early 90s, according to my records, to find out if they were still listening to the radio. Now, what that really means is I was mostly calling to find out if people were still alive. It was awful. I just had to make phone call after phone call, having no idea what I was walking into, no idea how recently someone had called this person, and definitely no idea if they were still alive or not. I ended up with a lot of awkward phone calls, and I ended up having to write off a lot of people who I either just couldn't find or I found out some pretty sad news about. It was a harsh wake-up call to the work world and what it really meant to try to do good and to try to put things in order. What I did based on that experience was that I started keeping very good records about the work that I was doing. Not only was I updating the contact information for these listeners, but I was also adding in notes about when I last spoke to them, who I was, the date I spoke to them, what I found out when I spoke to them. This is such a simple, basic thing, and yet we don't think about it. I certainly wouldn't have thought about it if I wasn't in that situation. But it's critical. There's so many times if you're in a position where you know you're not going to be there forever, which honestly should be all of us, but definitely when you're in AmeriCorps and you have a set end date, you should always be thinking about how will I make this easier for the next person. So that's what I talk about when I talk about continuous improvement, is looking at how it's done now. Are there ways that you can even just document what you are doing now? Because even just the act of writing down your process or what you have done will be immensely valuable to people after you. And then you can take it one step further, and once you've written down your process for how you're doing things now, you may think about small ways that you can make improvements upon it. One thing I did while I was still in that position was that I started a speakers bureau. And so I actually, in my role as the marketing coordinator, it had been that person's job to go out and do presentations to local clubs and let people know about this service. Well, I realized that not only could I not speak to that many groups in my limited time, but also I wasn't going to be there forever either. So if I could instead bring a group of community volunteers together who all cared about this topic and train them to go out and do outreach, the same presentation I had been doing, just train them, hand it over to them, then they would be able to not only reach more people, but they would have that institutional memory and stay longer than I was going to stay. One last thing I did was I created coverage maps. So one struggle we had being a radio service was that our radio signal wasn't necessarily always strong. And there were certain areas where it really had trouble. We have a lot of geography around here. We've got canyons, we've got mountains, we've got arroyos, all kinds of things. So the signal would get interfered with, and we'd get complaints or concerns or just pockets where we couldn't get any listeners because the signal didn't work there. And we were always fighting this from the beginning again, like, oh, where does the signal not work? I'm not sure. And we couldn't really be strategic about where to try to improve the signal or anything like that because we just didn't have the information. So that's another step that I took, was I started collecting that data, and then I started putting it into a visual. I mean, I used an actual map, and then I actually just took a, what do they call it, a transparency. Back in the day, we used transparencies. We put that over the map, and I could draw on it with a wet dry marker so that it had the most accurate data. I mean, today we may do something like GIS. This was like hand-drawn GIS, where we took the map and then we added a layer of the data that was super relevant to us. You might not have a mapping challenge, but you may have something else you're dealing with where just the act of collecting data and putting it in a different visualization could help your organization or the work that you're doing or the community you're serving see the problem in a new way that's really going to help them make more progress on it than they were making previously. And you have a new perspective. That's super valuable. This challenge, whatever it is that you're doing in your position, it's probably something people have been working on for quite a while. So you might sometimes think, what can I add to it? But you have your own perspective. And sometimes it helps to just share a different way of looking at things, and it will lead to new insights. I've seen this happen multiple times where either myself or AmeriCorps members I've worked with have been able to describe, explain, illustrate data about what they're working with in a way that leads to breakthroughs with the organization they're working with. So just think about that for a moment. You're probably collecting some kind of data for the position you're in. But is there a different way that you could present that data? Or some research you could do to see how to maybe add to it. So for example, I could have taken the data about the requests we were getting for this radio service and then layered it on top of signal challenges we were having to be able to create a map that showed where the priority areas should be. Like if we were able to fix the signal in this one pocket, we would be able to serve X amount of people. That was something that had never been done before. And it was relatively simple. The data was there. It was just taking a new perspective and a new way to bring it together.